Tonight on the Late Debate, the rise and rise of Wes Streeting, the Deputy Council Leader turned Shadow Health Secretary. We asked the Ilford North MP how he would tackle the growing list of problems circling the NHS. Heathrow in limbo. Why is there still no sign of the controversial third runway decades in the making?
Heathrow have been trying to get a third runway since the late 1940s. They haven't succeeded yet, and I don't see them succeeding, certainly this time round.
And with more tube and train strike misery, what will it take to break the deadlock? Good evening and welcome to the Late Debate. As political careers go, it seems Wes Streeting can't put a foot wrong. From local councillor in East London to a job in the Shadow Cabinet in less than 10 years. The Ilford North MP has one of the toughest roles in opposition, scrutinising health and social care. It wasn't long into Wes Streeting's political career that he was being referred to as one of Labour's rising stars. When the party won control of Redbridge Council in 2014, he was made deputy leader. 12 months later, he was out campaigning again in the general election after being chosen as Labour's candidate for Ilford North.
Wes Streeting, Labour Party, 21,000.
In an otherwise bad night for Labour, he bucked the trend and took the East London constituency from the Conservatives. On his first day in Parliament, he took the tube to work and recalled his early political ambitions.
I went back to my old secondary school last week, and one of my teachers helpfully reminded me that in his first lesson as a teacher at the school, I'd said I really need to get good grades to go to university so I could be Prime Minister.
Streeting was clearly uncomfortable during the Corbyn years, and when disquiet with the Labour leader's performance led to a shadow cabinet exodus, he didn't hold back.
We're a political party, not a cult, and it's time for him to step aside and allow fresh leadership.
In 2021, Streeting was treated for kidney cancer. Luckily, it was caught early.
Thanks to the NHS, I'm cancer-free, fighting fit and back in action.
Under Keir Starmer's leadership, Wes Streeting's career was back on the fast track. He was appointed Shadow Health Secretary. And I'm pleased to say Wes Streeting joins me in the studio now. Welcome, Wes.
Thanks very much for that montage.
Do you still want to be Prime Minister?
No, thanks. I'd be very happy to be Health Secretary. Thank you very much.
Can we talk first about the NHS pay offer today? What do you make of it?
Well, I'm glad we finally reached a resolution to most of the dispute. We've still got the junior doctors to go. I think my frustration is that had the government sat down to negotiate before Christmas, as the Royal College of Nursing offered and the other unions representing paramedics and the other NHS staff that have been out on strike, we could have avoided disruption, which caused the cancelled...
That's what you'd have done differently?
Yeah, absolutely, because we've 140,000 cancelled operations and appointments, and that's before the 3 days of junior doctor strikes this week. So I think it's been untold misery for patients, a kick in the teeth to staff who I think genuinely thought after they got us through the pandemic, surely even this government wouldn't allow us to go out on strike. And yet the government said, you know, stuff you nurses and NHS staff, the patients will turn against you. The government were proven wrong. They've had to eat some pretty big humble pie now, but they've also got to learn from this and sort out the junior doctors dispute, I hope, tomorrow.
But the nurses wanted 19%. They settled for 5%. Weren't the government right to hang out?
Well, I think it was perfectly reasonable to say we want a negotiation. And I was honest and said, you know, from the comfort of opposition, where sometimes people say, oh, well, you would say that you're in opposition. I was really upfront, actually, and said, 19.5% is not something I would be able to deliver if I were the health secretary, but I would be willing to negotiate. And I don't understand why the government didn't take the nurses up on that offer pre-Christmas, because you'll remember the nurses said, just agree to talk to us about pay and we will call off the strike action and suspend it while the talks happen. So why didn't they do that? It was surely the easiest yes they could have given.
OK, that's your message to government. What's your message or advice to the doctors who want 35%?
Look, again, and I've spoken to the BMA about this, I can't honestly say that we'd be able to deliver 35% overnight. I understand they're reasonable requests around pay for junior doctors who I think are really struggling, and I've met plenty of junior doctors on the front line who I think are struggling financially, are experiencing burnout, and I think do deserve
So what's a reasonable figure?
Respect of sitting around. Well, I wouldn't, if I was the health secretary, I wouldn't give a figure before negotiations.
But you're not the health secretary yet.
I wouldn't do that as a shadow health secretary either, because I want to be the health secretary. But I just ask people to judge Labour on our record as well. When we were last in government, and we went through the mill on this pre-97, we said, as the economic circumstances allow, we're back in that position again. But do you know what the last Labour government did? Fair pay rises every year and actually full pay restoration. And we were able to do that because we got the economy growing.
Everybody agrees the health service is in crisis. What's your big plan?
Well, firstly, I think we've got to sort out the workforce, which isn't just about the pay and retention of the staff we already have, which is crucial, of course. But with workforce shortages in the NHS today, we've also got to plan for the future, and that's why Labour's committed to the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history, doubling the number of medical school places, 10,000 more nursing and midwifery clinical training places, as well as a big expansion of district nurses and abolishing the non-dom tax status. And you know, so I genuinely thought Jeremy Hunt was going to nick Labour's policy in the budget this week. I've been goading him to do it. I know he agrees with us because he said when he was chair of the Health Select Committee that the Conservatives should nick Labour's plan on the basis that smart governments nick the best ideas of their opponents. The offer's still there, Jeremy, but what a missed opportunity, because everyone knows it takes years to train new NHS staff, and that's why I would have genuinely been happy if he'd stolen it in the budget this week so they could get cracking, and certainly if we win the next general election, it would give us a head start.
Okay,
and that's
your plan for the staff. What about the buildings? Hospitals are in a terrible state. Take Whips Cross,
absolutely.
which serves your constituents. What would you do there?
Well, firstly, I think the government's got to be honest about the state of the 40 new hospitals. I can't see a serious budget line against 40 new hospitals. If they can't deliver 40 and they can deliver fewer, better just to be upfront about that and allow Whips and other hospitals to get cracking. Instead, whether it's Whips, whether it's Leeds General Infirmary, whether or not it's Liz Truss's local hospital, which is literally being held up as the ceilings threatens to fall in, why not just let those hospitals crack on?
Under a Labour government, there will be fewer new hospitals than promised by Boris Johnson.
Well, we're looking carefully at the capital pressures. I mean, there's a broader reform agenda that I'm looking at, which is about how we get healthcare out of hospitals into local communities. The district nursing I mentioned is part of that. But we've got to fix the front door to the NHS in primary care, which is partly about access to GPs, but also other services in the community too. Yeah, and look, GPs are providing 1 million more appointments now than they were before the pandemic, but still 1 in 7 people, waiting too long to see a GP, couldn't get an appointment. So there's clearly a problem there. Doubling the number of medical school places would help. Keeping the GPs we already have by fixing the doctors' pensions will help. But I think there's more that we need to do to expand different routes into primary care. Pharmacies under enormous pressure, but they can do a hell of a lot of good for patients. So let's make sure we keep our community pharmacies and get the best out of them.
Have you got a plan for adult social care? Take the pressure off care homes and people having to sell their homes to go into care homes.
I think the immediate thing, similarly to the NHS, on workforce, we are struggling to recruit and retain the care staff that we need. So even when the government pours money into the system overall, unless it's going to a serious workforce strategy and serious career progression for care workers, we're not going to get either the access or the quality of care that's needed. That'd be my first priority. Beyond that, we're looking at a more fundamental reform agenda about how we make sure that whether you're a working age disabled person or whether you are someone looking towards later life and then even end of life care, how do we provide great quality care? And crucially, how do we fund it? Because actually, and look, this is plenty of blame to go around on this, under successive governments, Labour and Conservatives, we haven't cracked this. And whenever people have come forward with proposals, Labour and Conservative opponents have shot it down. So I'm keen to take some of the politics out of this and to get to a more sustainable long-term solution for social care so that we've got a system in social care that we can be proud of, as we have with the NHS for most of the last 75 years. Maybe not at the moment.
Wes Streeting, thank you for talking to us this evening.
Thank you.
Now, Heathrow's third runway was meant to create thousands of jobs, boost the economy and keep the airport competitive, according to its backers. But more than 2 years after a legal victory gave the £16 billion project the go-ahead, there's still not a bulldozer in sight, and the grand plan remains up in the air. A relief to many living in earshot of Britain's busiest airport who fought for years to keep it that way. But with Heathrow's boss insisting the project must go ahead, campaigners still have a fight on their hands.
Heathrow have been trying to get a third runway since the late 1940s. They haven't succeeded yet, and I don't see them succeeding this time round.
Justine Bailey is one of the stalwarts of the campaign to stop Heathrow's expansion. The village of Harmondsworth has been her home for 30 years. In that time, she's learnt to live with the airport on her doorstep.
You close the double glazing in the summer, you go out in the garden in the quieter periods, but it's always there. The trouble is with their expansion plans, they want to come a kilometre closer, which would mean putting on ear defenders when I open my front door.
It's more than 2 years since the Supreme Court gave Heathrow the green light to go ahead. The airport's official position is that the £16 billion development is under review. But backers, including businesses and unions, say the case for the third runway is as strong as ever.
It's a hub airport, it's a main hub airport, and to compete with the other hub airports in Europe, it needs to have a third runway. The whole economy will benefit by that in London and the wider economy in the UK as well.
Over half of our trade now as a country by value comes through this airport. If we want to grow that, if we want to be a trading nation post-Brexit, we have to reach those new destinations. It's a great opportunity to create jobs, to create new apprenticeships as well.
Even with the third runway, the airport believes it can substantially cut carbon emissions thanks to so-called sustainable aviation fuel and the prospect of electric and hydrogen aircraft engines. It's an argument opponents don't buy.
This is not the sort of development that we need for our economy. We need a green industrial revolution, a Green New Deal where we're investing in alternative energy and we're moving people away from polluting forms of transport in this way.
For anti-third runway campaigners, the last few decades have been a rollercoaster ride of highs and lows, and it still hasn't ended. To discuss that and other capital issues, I'm joined now by the Labour Business Shadow Minister and Feltham and Heston MP, Seema Malhotra, for the Conservatives, the Crime and Policing Minister and Croydon South MP, Chris Philp, and for the Liberal Democrats, Sarah Olney, the Richmond Park MP and the party's spokesperson for Business and Treasury. Seema, if Labour's serious about wanting the highest sustained growth in G7, you've got to back a third runway, haven't you?
I do recognise that this is going through a review and it's also going through a review post the pandemic. Labour's been very clear that to support a third runway, we would need to see some guarantees of tests being met by Heathrow. And indeed, Heathrow recently have said they believe that those can be met. And that includes measures around air pollution, noise pollution, climate mitigations, and also making sure that the whole of the UK will benefit from this investment.
So Labour could support a third runway if the conditions were...
It depends on these tests being met. And I think what's important is that we recognise as well that aviation is a really important industry for our competitiveness. There's 22 billion in the industry, 500,000 people who work in aviation. And for me as a local constituency MP, my constituents are those who are also going to the airport every day. They're going not just to fly the planes, they're running the airport, they're looking after the border force, and they want to see, as a majority, they want to see expansion, but they also want a fair deal, and they will recognise these challenges.
Can we ask Chris, what is the government's position on Heathrow at the moment?
Well, I mean, the government obviously is in favour of economic growth. We're in favour of job creation. We're in favour of cementing London's position as a globally successful capital city, and that does mean being an aviation hub, as we saw people say, including trade unions, on your clip. So that is really important. Yes, it needs to be done in a way that is environmentally friendly, that addresses environmental concerns. So that is a test that Heathrow Airport will have to meet. But if they can meet those tests, then I think a third runway will help our economy. We shouldn't also forget Gatwick Airport, not far, of course, from Croydon, where they've got a standby runway that can be brought into use pretty quickly and easily as well. So, look, I think being an aviation centre is something that can drive London's growth and economic prosperity, create jobs even further.
Sarah, you've campaigned against the third runway. Do you suspect it will happen eventually?
No, I don't think so, actually. And if anything, I think the prospects of a third runway are about as far away as they've ever been. We know that Heathrow Airport are experiencing serious problems finding the right finance for it. They've just lost a court case recently brought by the airlines about landing charges, for example, which were going to be critical in terms of funding the third runway, and they've lost that. I think investors are starting to pull out. They're starting to lose support across the aviation sector for a third runway. And, you know, apart from anything else, infrastructure projects, construction projects all over the capital and all over the country are starting to be scaled back because inflation has massively increased the cost of both materials and labour.
As we've seen from HS2.
HS2 is a really good example, but actually where we should be putting our investment, and particularly in these times when it is more difficult, is in rail transport rather than aviation, because we need to get to our net zero targets.
Let's talk about rail transport, because we've had another week of rail strikes and tube strikes. Chris, on the tube strikes, this is not about pay. It's largely about the pension scheme and the demand from the government that TfL save £100 million from the pension scheme. If you had your pension scheme torn up after you signed up to it, you'd be pretty unhappy, wouldn't you?
Well, the government isn't telling TfL what to do. It's up to TfL to manage its own finances responsibly. The government's given TfL, I think, £6 billion in recent years, partly due to the pandemic, of course. Sadiq Khan also has business rates retention, which has given him a huge amount of extra money. So it's up to Sadiq Khan to manage his finances responsibly, which he has abjectly failed to do once again. When Sadiq Khan was elected as Mayor of London, when he ran for Mayor of London 6 or 7 years ago, he promised 0 days of strikes. I think Londoners have now been blighted by about 165 days of strikes under Sadiq Khan, thanks to his incompetent financial mismanagement. And I think Londoners, frankly, are sick of the misery that Sadiq Khan has inflicted on them.
Simi, you're shaking your head there, not nodding in agreement.
I think Chris knows, though he hasn't said it, he knows that one of the conditions that was tied to the extra money that the TfL received during the pandemic was to do a review of the pension schemes. And that was a measure that Sadiq said would be a problem. He did not support that being in there, but he was forced to. And I think Chris has just missed the point about the pandemic, because the support that came to TfL was partly how we kept London moving. Your own constituents would have been those who have been able to stay in their jobs, who have been able to get to work, who have been able to do all those things that were really important during the pandemic. And we were really, really lucky that we had a mayor and also the government then working together to keep London moving. I think what is really important here is that we don't turn this into a battle, a party political battle, because there's clearly complexity here. And Chris will also know that before the pandemic, there were 70% fewer strikes than there were under the previous strike days and under the previous mayor. We've got to sort these issues out by getting round the table. And I think, Chris, you should do a little bit better for London on that.
Well, I think the government has provided huge amounts of money for TfL, the £6 billion I mentioned, and the business rates retention. I've got to be honest, the way that Sadiq Khan has managed TfL's budget has frankly been appalling.
Issue?
And it's up to Sadiq Khan to decide how he wants to balance his budget.
So he can have the final say on the pension, can he?
Well, he sets the way the TfL's finances work. It's a dispute between him and the trade unions.
Which was a condition.
And he promised us when he ran for office. Now maybe it was a foolish promise, but he promised.
It was a condition from number 10.
He promised 0 days of strikes. There have been 165.
Sarah, your constituents, an awful lot of them commute from out of London. Do you think they've become so used to the strikes that they've found other ways around doing their jobs, and there won't be so many people on the tubes and the trains, and there won't be so many tube and train services because of that?
Well, I think that is right, actually. I mean, obviously in Richmond, very lucky we've got both tube and train services, so people have been able to switch between the two over the last couple of days. But there's no doubt after the pandemic, people have found ways of working from home, and lots of the kind of like the online meeting tools that we were using during the lockdown, people can use those now to communicate with work. We've seen much more people choosing to work 2 or 3 days from home instead of commuting into the office, and that's had real benefits for quality of life. So I do think that the strikes have not had the impact that they might have done some years ago. But that's something that actually there is a bit of a risk there, because if people start to get used to not using the train or using the tube, then that does create serious problems about the sustainability of our public transport network. And it is absolutely vital that we maintain services and that we maintain a sustainable network.
The big news in Westminster this week, of course, was Jeremy Hunt's budget. Chris, what was in it for London?
Well, I think what was in it for London was first of all, huge incentives to invest. Those measures to give businesses large tax rebates when they make capital investments worth £9 billion a year will help London businesses invest to create even more jobs. We already have pretty much the lowest unemployment for 50 years. This will encourage the creation of even more jobs. I was also very interested by the measures around childcare. The 30 free hours of childcare per week for working parents, starting at the age of 9 months, going up to school age. The measures around increased payments for childcare for those on universal credit, extra money for people, the providers who provide childcare, who have been saying The hourly rates they're paid aren't enough. Those are being increased. Changing the ratios from 1 to 4 to 1 to 5, like in Scotland, to make it a bit cheaper for those people running nurseries to provide the services. So a phenomenal package there to help working parents get back into the workforce while making sure their youngsters get looked after.
Were you cheering Jeremy Hunt over childcare?
Well, Jeremy Hunt and childcare, the childcare matters, of course we welcome the moves that have been made, but it was a case of catch-up because he used almost the same words that Bridget Phillipson, our Shadow Education Secretary, has used about needing to have wraparound from the end of maternity or paternity leave up to the end of primary school. But what Chris hasn't said and what the government didn't acknowledge this week is that we have seen in the last 18 months over 5,400 childcare providers go under across the country because there hasn't been enough funding on the DfE's own figures. They've been underfunding childcare provision. And it has meant that even at the moment, you've got less than 50% of local authorities able to support the provision of that childcare. That's why that childcare isn't even happening this year. It's basically another case of the government coming to the party very, very late. And what I would say is this is a budget on the government's own, on the OBR's own analysis that is going to still see people being worse off than they are today and actually see growth downgraded. This was hardly a budget for growth if the OBR is downgrading.
Sarah, what would you have liked to see?
Well, I think what most people in the capital are feeling right now is that their household incomes are being severely squeezed. Their fuel bills are going up, their food bills are going up. They're having to pay more on their mortgages and for their rent because of the increase in interest rates, largely triggered by the mini budget back in September. And what, of course, the Chancellor didn't spell out in his budget is that people are going to be paying much, much more in tax, and London is going to be disproportionately impacted by that. People are going to pay so much more in tax, and the childcare is great, but it's not coming in for another few years. And what we didn't see in the budget was anything to really help people across London help with the cost of living right now. We'd have liked to have seen much more on fuel bills. We think that's something the government could do right now to help people with the squeeze on their incomes that's happening right now.
So look, we know there are cost of living pressures. They're felt across Western Europe and across the United States, caused mainly by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Interest rates are rising. Let me finish. Hang on, interest rates are rising.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you because I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'd like to have heard the rest of it, but sorry about that. That's all we've got time for tonight. Thank you to my guests. Where's Chris Seamer and Sarah will be back next month. Until then, thank you for watching and good night.